There is a moment at every auction when the crowd decides something has no value. You can feel it happen. The auctioneer's voice loses its urgency. The bidders stop turning their heads. The item sits there under the open sky, and the silence around it becomes its own kind of verdict. Not guilty of anything, just worthless, just done. That moment came on a Saturday morning in August of 1976 at the Lackawanna County Surplus Auction in Scranton, Pennsylvania, when the auctioneer finally got to the last item on his list, a 1952 Holmes 440 wrecker. It sat at the back of the lot, separated from everything else, the way a sick animal gets separated from the herd. The paint had faded from Holmes red to something closer to the color of an old wound rust, orange streaked with brown, peeling at the edges, where the metal had given up fighting the weather. 3 of the 4 tires were flat. The boom cable hung loose off the back winch, frayed at the end like a rope someone had cut in a hurry. The windshield had a crack running corner to corner, a single diagonal line that made the whole cab look like it was already broken in two. Someone from the city garage had spray painted the words "City Surplus as is" across the driver's door in uneven white letters, and even those were starting to peel. The crowd had been there since 7 in the morning. They had bid on a 1968 Chevy flatbed, a road grader with a cracked frame, 2 portable generators, a stack of highway signs, still in their original wrapping. Real things, useful things, things that could be put to work by the end of the week. Nobody had been thinking about the homes at the back of the lot, and now that the auctioneer was pointing at it, nobody wanted to start. The auctioneer was a man named Gus Pellerin, thick through the middle with the voice of someone who had been talking for money his entire adult life. He looked at the wrecker the way a doctor looks at a chart when the news isn't good. All right, folks, last item of the morning. He let that sit for a second. 1952 Holmes 440 wrecker, retired from city service in 1969, has been in storage since that time. Sold as is, no warranty, expressed or implied. Probably needs everything. He paused. Do I hear $200? Silence. Not the polite silence of a crowd thinking it over. The silence of a crowd that had already decided. Come on, somebody needs a project. Let's say 100. A few people in the front row exchanged looks. Someone near the portable coffee table chuckled into his paper cup. $50, folks. $50 for a piece of Scranton working history. That was when a voice came from the back of the crowd. 200. People turned. The man who had spoken was young, mid-20s, maybe standing near the rear of the auction area with his hands in the pockets of his work pants. He wasn't tall, wasn't broad. He had the kind of build that comes from actual work rather than any deliberate effort to build it. Shoulders that sat square and level hands that were already permanently stained with the particular darkness that engine grease leaves behind no matter how hard you scrub. His face was calm in a way that didn't look practiced. It looked like something that had been arrived at. Gus Pellerin blinked. He had not expected this. I have 200. Do I hear 250? The crowd had gone quiet in a different way now. This was the silence of people watching something they didn't entirely understand. Nobody answered. 200 going once. 300. The young man's voice again. Same flat tone, like he was reading a number off a gauge. Now people were looking at each other with expressions that hovered somewhere between confusion and entertainment. The kid had just outbid himself on a wrecker that hadn't moved under its own power since Lyndon Johnson was finishing his first term. Gus leaned forward slightly. Sir, you are currently the only bidder. You don't need to. 350. The laughter started somewhere in the middle of the crowd and spread outward like a stone dropped in still water. Not mean laughter, not entirely. The kind of laughter that comes when something is so far outside normal behavior that the only available response is amusement. A few men laughed the way they laughed at a good joke. A few laughed the way they laughed at someone doing something genuinely foolish. Most laughed because everyone else was laughing, and it was a nice morning, and why not? Sold, Gus said quickly, before anything else could happen, to the young man in the back for $350. The young man walked to the payment table without looking at anyone. He counted out 18 $20 bills from a folded envelope he kept in his inside jacket pocket, set them on the table in a neat stack, and signed the transfer paperwork with the careful signature of a man who didn't sign many official documents and wanted this one to be right. His name was Danny Kovar. He was 26 years old. He had just spent the better part of 6 months' savings on a wrecker that hadn't run since Richard Nixon was a senator. He was walking back toward the homes when the big hand came down on his shoulder. Carl Briggs was 45 years old, and he wore his success the way some men wear a good coat, naturally, without thinking about it, as if he had never known anything different. He owned Briggs Heavy Recovery, which was the largest towing operation in Lackawanna County, and he had built it the way he believed all serious businesses should be built, by moving fast, borrowing smart, and not being sentimental about equipment or anything else. I had 6 wreckers, all of them Chevrolet C60s, all of them newer than 1971, all of them painted the same dark green with Briggs in gold block letters on both doors. He drove a new pickup truck. He wore pressed work shirts with his name on the chest pocket. He had strong opinions about most things, and he shared them freely because, in his experience, strong opinions delivered with enough confidence were usually mistaken for wisdom. He stepped in front of Danny Kovar with the comfortable ease of a man who was used to the world making room for him. "Son," he said loud enough for the people nearby to hear clearly, "did you just spend $350 on that pile of rust?" Danny looked at him. "Yes, sir." Carl shook his head slowly, the way a disappointed teacher shakes his head at a bright student who has made a preventable error. "Do you know what $350 could buy you?" Danny said nothing. "That's 3 months of payments on a real wrecker. Something from this decade. Something with rubber on all 4 tires and an engine that actually turns over." Carl gestured toward the parking area where his dark green pickup sat gleaming in the August sun. "I have got a 1974 Chevy C60 I could put you into, $200 a month. You'd be in business by Monday morning, pulling calls by Monday afternoon. I can fix this one." Carl Briggs laughed. It was a large laugh, the laugh of a man who had heard many things and found this particular thing especially entertaining. "Danny, is it Danny? Danny, that wrecker has not run since Nixon was in the White House. The first Nixon administration. The engine is probably seized solid. The hydraulics haven't moved in 7 years. You'd need $2,000 in parts before you even got to labor, and that's assuming the frame is sound, which I would not assume." He stepped slightly closer, and his voice shifted into something that was meant to sound like honest advice, but came out as something else. "Listen, I know what you're trying to do. Small operations serve the neighborhood, keep the overhead low. That's not a bad instinct, but you cannot build anything on a wreck. You need a foundation, and a foundation means a truck that runs." Danny looked at Carl's pressed shirt, at his clean hands, at the easy smile of a man who had never once doubted that the world would accommodate him. "My father taught me something, Mr. Briggs." His voice was quiet, but it carried. "He said the worst mistake a working man can make is spending his life paying someone else to own his tools." I walked past Carl toward the wrecker, leaving the biggest towing operator in Lackawanna County standing at the edge of the auction lot with his mouth open slightly and an expression that wasn't quite sure what it wanted to be. The laughter from the crowd had faded, but it hadn't quite disappeared. It hung in the warm August air around the auction lot like the smell of exhaust. Danny Kovar did not look back. To understand what happened over the next 19 years, you have to understand where Danny Kovar came from. Not just the neighborhood, not just the family. You have to understand the particular combination of things that make a man into the kind of person who bids against himself at a public auction for a machine everyone else has written off and feels completely certain while doing it. Danny grew up in South Scranton in a neighborhood built on the bones of the steel industry. The streets there had a specific quality of seriousness, a heaviness that came from generations of people who had worked hard at physical things and expected their children to do the same. The houses were close together and well maintained in the way that poor houses get well maintained when the people inside them have too much pride to let things go. Small yards, straight fences, window boxes in the spring. His father, Walter Kovar, had come to Scranton from Czechoslovakia in 1938, 18 years old, speaking almost no English, carrying one suitcase and a set of machinist tools that had belonged to his own father. He found work at the Lackawanna Iron and Steel Plant within 2 weeks of arriving, because men who could read a micrometer and knew how to treat metal were always needed regardless of what language they spoke when they weren't working. Walter spent 30 years at that plant, 30 years of shift work and noise and heat and the particular exhaustion that comes from a kind of labor that demands everything your body has and doesn't much care what it does to you in the process. He learned English from his co-workers, married a woman named Helena, whose family had come from the same part of Czechoslovakia a generation earlier, bought a small house on a street where everyone knew each other's business because the houses were close enough together that you couldn't avoid it, and raised his son to understand that dignity was not something you were given. It was something you made with your hands every single day. The plant closed in 1971, 30 years of Walter Kovar's life, and then one morning there were men in suits standing at the gate with papers, and that was that. The economy had changed. The industry had changed. The things Walter knew how to do were suddenly not things that anyone in Scranton needed done anymore. He was 53 years old. He did what he knew. He set up a workspace in his garage, spread the word through the neighborhood, and started fixing cars. Not because it was a business plan, not because he had studied the market and identified an opportunity, because people he knew needed their cars fixed, and fixing things was what Walter Kovar understood how to do, and he was not the kind of man who sat down when there was work available. Danny grew up watching this. He was 11 years old when the plant closed, and his father moved into the garage, and by the time he was 12, he was in there with him, not being taught exactly. Walter was not a man who gave lessons. He was a man who worked, and if you were in the same space, you absorbed what he was doing, because there was nothing else to absorb. Danny learned to read a torque spec. He learned that different metals expand at different rates when they heat up, and why that matters when you're fitting parts together. He learned that an engine will tell you what's wrong with it if you know how to listen, and that knowing how to listen is mostly just a matter of patience combined with enough experience to recognize what you're hearing. By the time he was 15, he could rebuild a carburetor from components. By 18, he could diagnose a transmission problem by the sound it made under load. By the time he graduated high school, in an era when most of his classmates were either heading to the University of Scranton on financial aid or straight into whatever work they could find, Danny Kovar knew more about internal combustion engines than most people who had been working on them professionally for a decade. I went to work at the Texaco station on Musick Street, not because it was his dream, because it was the thing available to him that was closest to what he knew how to do, and because it paid, and because Danny was not the kind of young man who waited for perfect circumstances before he started moving. He spent 6 years at that station, oil changes and brake jobs and tune-ups and the occasional engine rebuild for a regular customer who trusted him enough to leave the car for a week. He was good at the work, and he was honest about what things cost, and he was never late, and those qualities in combination meant that people asked for him specifically, which meant the station owner kept giving him hours, which meant the paychecks kept coming, Every dollar he didn't need, he saved. I wasn't saving for anything specific, not at first. He was saving because Walter Kovar had raised him to understand that a man without a reserve was a man without options, and a man without options was not really a free man at all, regardless of what the law said about him. But as the years at the Texaco station went by, the thing he was saving toward came into focus. He wanted to start a towing operation. Small, just him and one truck at least to begin with. Serve the neighborhood, the Czech families and the Irish families, and the Italian families and the Slovak families, and all the other working families in South Scranton who couldn't afford to call Briggs Heavy Recovery at 2 in the morning and pay whatever Carl Briggs felt like charging that week. I had done the arithmetic. A truck, no payments, low overhead, competitive rates. It was not a complicated business model. The complexity was in the first part, the part that required acquiring a truck without going into debt to do it, because Danny had seen enough men in South Scranton spend their working lives servicing loans that never quite got paid off to understand that debt was not a tool. It was a weight, and once you put it on, it came with you everywhere. When he heard about the Lackawanna County surplus auction and the old city wrecker, he understood immediately what he was looking at. Not a junk truck, an opportunity in bad packaging. The first week nearly broke him, and not in the way he had expected. Danny borrowed a tow dolly from a neighbor and hauled the Holmes back to his father's garage on a Tuesday evening. It took 3 men to push it off the dolly because the wheels were locked and the parking brake had seized in place, and when they finally muscled it inside and got the garage door down against the August heat, Walter Kovar walked a slow circle around it in the way he always walked circles around things he was evaluating. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he put his hand on the hood, felt along the faded paint to the edge of the engine cover, and pressed down gently in 2 places. "I know this truck," he said. Danny looked at him. "We had 2 of them at the mill. Used them for moving heavy equipment around the floor when the overhead crane was down." Walter straightened up, pressing one hand briefly against the small of his back in the habitual gesture of a man whose spine had been carrying heavy loads for 30 years. 1952 Holmes, built in Chattanooga. Simple design, strong frame, no electronics to fail, no computers, no systems that require a specialist to diagnose. He looked at Danny with something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. These trucks were built to outlast the men who drove them. The engine seized, Danny said. Then free it. The hydraulics are full of rust. Then flush them and rebuild the seals. Walter, I have got $180 left. His father looked at him for a moment, not with pity. Walter Kovar did not traffic in pity, not even when it was warranted. He looked at his son the way he looked at a piece of metal that needed reshaping, with the concentrated attention of a man who was calculating what it would take. "Then you start with what $180 can buy," Walter said, "and you figure out the rest when you get there. That is how I fixed everything at the mill for 30 years, one piece at a time." He walked to his chair in the corner of the garage, the wooden chair with the cracked arm that had been there as long as Danny could remember, and he sat down and reached for his cigarettes, and that was the end of the conversation. Danny pulled a workbench light close to the engine and started taking it apart. What he found over the next several evenings confirmed everything Carl Briggs had said at the auction, and several things Carl Briggs hadn't known to say. The engine was more than seized. The pistons had essentially fused themselves to the cylinder walls through 7 years of alternating temperature and rust. The hydraulic pump had a hairline crack that had allowed fluid to drain completely and then allowed moisture to take its place. The wiring was not just frayed, but in several places had shorted against the frame, leaving carbon traces and the particular smell of burned insulation that tells an experienced mechanic how close something came to catastrophe. The brake lines were perforated with rust in at least 4 places Danny could find, and probably more he hadn't found yet. He sat on the garage floor at 2 in the morning on a Thursday with a yellow legal pad on his knee, and he wrote down every component that needed attention, and next to each component, he wrote his best estimate of what that part would cost. Then he added the column. The total was just under $2,000. He had 180. He sat there for a while. The garage was quiet, except for the sound of traffic on the street outside and the occasional click of the hot water heater in the corner. From somewhere in the house, he could hear the sound of the television, his mother watching the late news, the way she watched the late news every night of her life. Danny looked at the legal pad. Then he looked at the Holmes, which sat in the center of the garage under the fluorescent light, like something that had given up hoping for better circumstances a long time ago. He thought about Carl Briggs, about the easy certainty of that laugh, about the way Carl had said the words $2,000 as if they were the end of a conversation rather than a challenge that could be answered. He thought about his father's words, one piece at a time. He stood up. He set the legal pad on the workbench. He picked up a socket wrench, fit the right head onto it, and went back to the engine. The solution to the money problem was not elegant, but it was workable. Danny was still employed at the Texaco station, still pulling full-time hours, and every paycheck that came in got divided the same way: what he needed to live on, what he was saving for the next part, and nothing else. He bought components in the order they needed to be addressed, which meant starting with the engine, because nothing else mattered if the engine didn't turn over. The cylinder boring, he couldn't do himself. It required machine tools he didn't have, but there was a machine shop on Cedar Avenue whose owner knew Walter and owed him a favor from years back, and the cost came down to something manageable. Danny pulled the engine block himself, transported it in the back of his car, and brought it back when the work was done. He re-ringed the pistons, ground the valves by hand in the evenings, the slow circular motion that cuts a new seating surface, working by feel as much as by measurement, replaced the head gasket, and torqued the head bolts in the proper sequence twice, because the first time he thought the torque wrench might be reading slightly off. The hydraulics took longer. Replacing seals in a system that old meant finding seals that weren't manufactured anymore, which meant either having them made or finding suitable substitutes from other applications. Danny spent 2 Saturday mornings at a hydraulic supply house in Scranton, going through their parts catalog with the patience of a man who understood that the right answer was in there somewhere if he was willing to look long enough. Through all of it, Walter was there, not helping exactly, not interfering, sitting in his chair in the corner, smoking his cigarettes, reading the paper in the morning and the crossword in the evening. Occasionally he would come and stand beside Danny and look at whatever Danny was working on, and sometimes he would say something and sometimes he wouldn't, and what he said when he said anything was almost always a question rather than a statement. And the questions were the kind that made Danny think rather than the kind that gave him answers. How do you know the crack in the pump? Housing isn't just surface rust. What happens to brake fluid when it sits in a line for 7 years? If the boom cable is frayed at one end, where else is it likely to be weak? Danny would think about the question, and sometimes he would answer it out loud, and sometimes he would just go look, and either way, he would find out something he needed to know. That was how Walter taught, not by knowing more than the person he was teaching, which he often did, but by knowing which questions would make the other person smarter. The months accumulated. November brought the first hard frost, and Danny was still working, his breath misting in the garage because the space heater only did so much. February buried South Scranton under 18 inches of snow, and Danny was still working, coming home from the Texaco station, still smelling of other people's motor oil, and going straight to the garage for another 3 hours. April brought something new. Walter started coughing more than usual. Not a sick cough or not what Walter would admit was a sick cough, just a deeper, more persistent version of the clearing throat sound that Danny had heard from him for years. Walter said nothing about it, and Danny did not ask, because there was an unspoken agreement between them that had been in place for as long as Danny could remember, which was that certain things were acknowledged by being not mentioned rather than by being discussed. But Danny noticed. The homes came together the way all serious mechanical work comes together gradually, then suddenly. For months it was pieces and components and subsystems, each one completed and tested and set aside, and then at some point the pieces were all done, and it was time to put them together and find out what they added up to. It was the second week of August 1977, exactly 1 year after the auction. Danny had not planned it that way. It had simply worked out to be that long, because the work had taken what the work had taken, and he had not rushed any part of it. But standing in the garage that evening, with the homes assembled and the fluids filled and the battery charged on its maintainer, Danny was aware of the arithmetic of it. 1 year, $350 at the start, and roughly $1,200 more over the course of the 12 months spent carefully and by the piece. $2,000 less than Carl Briggs had said he would need before the engine would even turn over, and the hydraulics were rebuilt, and the brake lines were replaced, and the boom cable was new, and the tires were all aired, and the cracks in the windshield were filled and sealed. Not beautiful. The paint was still the color of old rust, and it was going to stay that way until he could afford something better, which was not soon. The lettering on the driver's door was still the peeling spray paint of the city surplus designation, which he had sanded down to a mostly smooth surface. It looked like what it was, a working truck that had been brought back from the edge by someone who knew what he was doing and didn't need it to be pretty. Walter came into the garage at 7 in the evening. He had been in the house, and he moved more slowly than he had a year ago, though he would not have said so, and Danny would not have said so either. He looked at the homes. He walked around it, the same slow circuit he had walked the first night, but different now, not evaluating, recognizing. He stopped at the driver's door and put his hand flat against the faded metal and left it there for a moment. Then he stepped back and looked at his son. "Start it," he said. Danny climbed into the cab. The seat was cracked and hard and smelled of old vinyl and decades of other men's working days. The steering wheel was large and thin-rimmed in the style of trucks made before power steering when you needed leverage. The dashboard gauges were simple: oil pressure, temperature, fuel, battery. No radio, no extras. The kind of instrument panel that said, "I will tell you what you need to know," and nothing else. He set the choke, put his foot on the clutch, set his hand on the key. He did not look at Walter. He was not ready to look at Walter until after. He turned the key. The starter motor engaged. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times. Then a cough, deep and slightly ragged, the sound of something that had been waiting a long time, being asked to work again. A second cough, and then it caught. The engine settled into a rhythm that was low and solid, and even not the tentative sound of something barely working, but the confident sound of something that remembered what it was built for. The gauges on the dash came up one by one, oil pressure first climbing quickly to the right side of the normal range, then temperature beginning its slow upward movement from cold. Danny sat in the driver's seat with his hands in his lap and listened to the engine run. He did not smile. He did not speak. He sat in the particular stillness of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. After a moment, he looked through the windshield at his father. Walter Kovar was standing at the garage door with his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was not the expression of a man surprised. It was the expression of a man who had known this outcome was possible from the beginning and had simply been waiting to see whether his son had it in him. He nodded once, not a small nod, a deliberate one, the kind that means, "I see you. I know what this cost you. You did it right." Then he turned and walked back toward the house, moving slowly against the August evening, and he did not say anything else, and he did not need to. Danny sat in the running truck for a long time after his father had gone inside. The next morning he drove to the hardware store and bought a can of red paint and a good brush. He took the can home to the garage, shook it for a long time, and painted 2 words on the driver's door in careful hand-lettered capitals: Kovar Recovery. It was not fancy. The letters were not perfectly uniform, but they were steady, and they were his, and when he stood back and looked at them in the morning light coming through the open garage door, he understood for the first time, with his whole body, not just his mind, what his father had been trying to teach him all those years. You don't own what someone else has to keep telling you you can use. He went to the phone and called Kinko's about business cards. I was 27 years old. He had 1 truck, no debt, and a name on the door. He was ready. The first call came on a Wednesday night in September of 1977, 3 weeks after Danny painted his name on the door. A woman named Mrs. Petrovsky, 71 years old. Czech had lived on the same block in South Scranton for 40 years, had driven her 1968 Buick LeSabre to the evening mass at Sacred Hearts and come out afterward to find it completely dead. No lights, no crank, nothing. Just a car that had decided it was done for the evening. She had Danny's card because her neighbor had Danny's card, and her neighbor had Danny's card because Walter Kovar had asked Danny to leave a small stack of them at the machine shop on Cedar Avenue, and at the hardware store on Pittston Avenue, and at the Slovak Social Hall, 3 blocks from the house, and word had moved the way word moves in a neighborhood where people have known each other for 30 years. Danny got the call at 9:15. He was at the homes in 11 minutes. It was the alternator, a 40-minute job parts he had on the truck. Mrs. Petrovsky stood on the church steps in her good coat and watched him work under the parking lot lights, and when he was done, she asked him what she owed, and he told her $35, and she looked at him the way old women look at young men when they are deciding whether to trust them. "Carl Briggs charges $75 for a service call," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why do you charge $35? Danny closed the hood of the Buick and wiped his hands on the rag he kept in his back pocket. "Because I don't have a payment on the truck," he said. "So $35 covers my costs and then some." She looked at him for another moment. Then she opened her purse and counted out 2 20s. "Keep the change," she said. "And here." She pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. "My daughter's phone number. Her husband has a 1971 Ford pickup that makes a noise he has been ignoring for 2 years. Tell him I sent you." He drove home that night with $40 in his pocket, and the particular feeling of a man who has finally started. The work came slowly at first, and then steadily, and then with enough regularity that Danny could see the shape of something building. He kept his hours at the Texaco station for the first 8 months, because the towing calls alone weren't enough yet to cover everything. But by the spring of 1978, the math had shifted enough that he gave his notice, thanked the station owner for 6 years of paychecks, and drove the homes out of the Texaco lot for the last time as an employee. How was on his own. The homes worked every day, not glamorous work. There is nothing glamorous about towing, which is fundamentally the business of showing up when something has gone wrong and making it slightly less wrong for a fee. Dead batteries and flat tires and cars in ditches, and the occasional more serious accident on Route 6 or the interstate. Danny was methodical about it. He answered every call. He was always on time, or as close to on time as the roads and the weather permitted. He charged what he said he would charge, and he didn't add things to the bill that hadn't been discussed, which was not universal practice in the towing industry, and which turned out to matter more than he had anticipated. People talked. In South Scranton, in 1978, people still talked the way they had always talked across back fences and in church parking lots and at the counter of the diner on Wyoming Avenue and in the slow checkout lines at the grocery store on a Saturday morning. And what they said about Danny Kovar was, consistent shows up, does the job, charges a fair price, doesn't make a hard situation harder. That was not a complicated reputation to build, but it was a durable one. And durability was what Danny had always been interested in. Carl Briggs saw him around town occasionally. The comments were always the same in spirit, if not in exact wording. Still driving that antique Danny? How's that 50-year-old wrecker holding up? You know I've still got that C60 if you ever come to your senses. Danny's answer never changed. Truck runs fine, Mr. Briggs. And it did. Month after month, oil every 3,000 miles, grease on the fittings, tension on the boom cable, and the homes kept working with the quiet reliability of something that had been built in an era when built to last was not a marketing phrase, but an engineering standard. The years moved. 1978 became 1979, and 1979 became 1980, and each year left its mark on the homes in the small ways that working equipment accumulates history. A new scratch here, a replaced seal, there a section of wiring redone after a rodent got into the engine compartment one winter and made decisions about insulation that were not in Danny's interest. The paint stayed the color of old rust because there was always something more important to spend money on. But Danny kept the mechanicals in a condition that would have satisfied Walter's standards, which were high. The business stayed small, and Danny did not try to make it otherwise, and that distinction mattered. I had watched enough men in South Scranton borrow their way into the appearance of success to understand that size and health were not the same thing. The neighborhood was full of stories. The contractor who expanded too fast and spent the rest of his career paying off the loans. The expansion had required the plumber who bought 3 new vans on credit when the work was good and spent 2 years scrambling when the work slowed down. The small restaurant owner who financed a second location and lost both of them. These were not cautionary tales that anyone told explicitly. They were just the background of the place, the texture of what Danny had grown up watching, and they had taught him something that Carl Briggs had apparently never learned, that the distance between looking successful and being secure was exactly the distance between what you owned and what you owed. The homes had cost him $350 and $1,200 in parts, and it was paid for. That was the foundation. Everything else he built on top of that foundation had to be paid for the same way, and if it couldn't be, he waited until it could. In 1981, Carl Briggs opened a new facility. It was a real operation, a 2-bay garage on the north side of town with Briggs Heavy Recovery in large illuminated letters on the facade, a parking area for his fleet that now numbered 8 trucks, all of them late model Chevrolets, all of them maintained by a staff of 3 full-time mechanics. He had a secretary. He had a dispatch radio system that cost more than Danny's entire first year of operating expenses. I had a contract with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation for highway recovery work on a 30-mile stretch of I-81, which meant guaranteed volume, predictable revenue, and the kind of institutional legitimacy that opened doors to other institutional contracts. He sent Danny an invitation to the open house, a printed card professional with the Briggs Heavy Recovery logo embossed on the front. Danny went. He stood in Carl's new parking area on a Friday evening in October with a paper cup of coffee and looked at the 8 green Chevrolets lined up in 2 neat rows under the floodlights. They were impressive in the way that new equipment is always impressive, clean and uniform, the gold lettering bright, the chrome on the light bars catching the floodlight and throwing it back. They represented a version of the towing business that was organized and scaled and serious. Carl found him after 20 minutes and walked him through the facility with the easy pride of a man showing something he had built. "This is what growth looks like," Carl said, standing in the center of the garage bay with the air of a man who had earned the right to say it. Danny looked at the lifts, the tool storage, the parts cabinets, the diagnostic equipment. He nodded slowly. "What do you owe the bank right now, Carl?" he asked. His voice was quiet, genuinely curious, no edge in it. Carl looked at him. A beat of silence that was a fraction of a second longer than a comfortable pause. "That's how business works, Danny," he said. His tone had shifted slightly, the warmth of the tour guide replaced by something more guarded. "You use the bank's money to build the asset, and the asset pays back the bank. That's basic." Danny nodded again. "Sure," he said. "What's the monthly number?" Carl smiled, but it was the smile of a man redirecting rather than the smile of a man who was comfortable. "Why don't you let me show you the dispatch room?" he said. Danny let himself be redirected. He finished his coffee, thanked Carl for the invitation, said the facility was impressive, and meant it. Then he walked out to the parking area, got into the homes, and drove home through the October dark. I was not angry at Carl. He was not contemptuous of what Carl had built. He drove in silence for most of the way home, and what he felt was something closer to a cold clarity about the difference between their two operations. Carl had borrowed to grow, and growth had required more growth to service the debt the first growth had created, and now Carl was managing a machine that required constant feeding. The contracts had to keep coming, the trucks had to keep running, the volume had to stay up. One bad quarter, one lost contract, one unexpected expense, and the whole structure had to be renegotiated with the bank, which meant the bank now had a seat at the table in every decision Carl made about his own business. Danny thought about the home sitting outside his father's garage the night they brought it home. $180 in his account, $2,000 of work needed, no plan except to start at the beginning and work forward. He thought about Walter, one piece at a time. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck with the engine idling for a moment. "He doesn't own 8 trucks," he said to no one. 8 trucks own him. He turned the engine off and went inside. In 1983, Danny hired Terrence Boyle. Terrence was 19 years old. Irish family, grew up 6 blocks from Danny in a house where the front porch needed repair and the lawn was sometimes mowed and sometimes wasn't, depending on what state his father was in. He had graduated high school the previous spring and spent the summer doing odd jobs and staying out of trouble, which in his case required some active effort. He had applied at the Texaco station and at 2 other garages and had not been hired at any of them, for reasons that were partly about his work history, which was thin, and partly about his last name, which carried associations in South Scranton that had nothing to do with Terrence himself. He showed up at Danny's garage on a Tuesday morning and knocked on the door and said he had heard Danny might need help. Danny looked at him for a moment. He remembered being 22 and walking into the Texaco station for the first time, and the way the owner had looked at him, at his work clothes, at his hands, at the careful way he held himself, that was trying to project competence without overclaiming it. "You know anything about mechanical work?" Danny asked. "Some," Terrence said. "I know more than I know how to prove in a conversation." Danny thought about that. "Come back tomorrow morning at 7, he said. "Bring whatever tools you own." Terrence showed up at 6:50 with a toolbox that held about a third of what a working mechanic needed, all of it in reasonable condition. Danny put him to work on a brake job and watched without watching the way Walter had watched him. By the end of the day, he knew 2 things. Terrence had good hands and a good instinct for mechanical work, and Terrence had been told often enough that he wasn't worth much that he had started to believe it. Danny hired him. The pay was modest because it had to be, and Terrence knew it, and that was fine. What Terrence got in exchange for modest pay was work every day, and someone who trusted him with real problems and didn't talk down to him, and for a young man in his situation, that turned out to be worth a considerable amount. They fell into a rhythm over the following months. Danny handled the towing calls. Terrence handled more and more of the mechanical work when there was mechanical work, and rode as second man on recoveries when there wasn't. The homes continued to run. Danny continued to charge $35 for calls that Carl Briggs charged $75 for. The gap between their operations remained enormous in terms of size and stayed roughly equal in terms of security, which is a different metric, and in Danny's view, the more important one. In 1985, Danny paid cash for a 1965 International tow truck. I had been watching it for 8 months, sitting in the back lot of a garage in Dunmore that was liquidating equipment after the owner retired. He had gone to look at it 3 times before he had the money, which was a form of discipline that required some effort, because the International was mechanically solid and priced accordingly, and he was not the only person who had noticed it. He bought it the week he had the full amount paid in cash, drove it home, serviced it completely over the following 2 weekends, and put it in operation. 2 trucks, no debt. Terrence could now run independent calls. The business had not grown in the way that Carl Briggs had grown. No new facility, no fleet of matching vehicles, no illuminated signage on a building anyone could see from the road, but it had deepened the way a root system deepens. Less visible, more stable. The homes ran every day. Danny never put Terrence in it for the first call of the morning. He drove it himself every single morning without ever quite saying why. Terrence didn't ask. Some things between men who work together communicate themselves without language. Then came the years that tested everything. The recession of the late 80s arrived in Scranton, the way recessions always arrive, not suddenly, but with the slow accumulating weight of individual bad news adding up to a general deterioration. Businesses that had been marginal became unprofitable. Businesses that had been profitable became marginal. People stopped driving as much, which meant fewer breakdowns, which meant less towing work. The construction on I-81 that had been generating highway recovery calls got put on hold. 3 of Danny's regular commercial accounts closed their doors within 18 months of each other. Carl Briggs lost his Penn-Doughty contract in the spring of 1988. Danny heard about it from a dispatcher at the County Emergency Services Office, who mentioned it the way people mention things that aren't exactly their news to share, but seem relevant to the person they're talking to. The contract had gone to a larger operation out of Wilkes Barre that had underbid Carl significantly, and without that guaranteed volume, the math on Carl's 8 trucks and his facility and his 3 mechanics and his secretary and his monthly bank payments became considerably more complicated. Danny watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with the particular attention of a man who knows he is seeing something instructive. Carl sold 2 trucks in the fall of 1988, let one of his mechanics go, renegotiated the lease on his facility to a smaller space. He was still operating, still visible around town, still driving his new pickup. But something had changed in the structure of things, in the way a building changes when the load-bearing wall gets compromised, even if the facade is still intact. Danny's operation took its own hits in those years. Volume was down. Terrence went to 4 days a week for a period of about 8 months because that was what the work justified, and Danny had an honest conversation with him about it, and Terrence appreciated the honesty, which was not universal practice among employers. Danny cut his own draw from the business to the minimum that life required and saved the rest. Not much to save, but something, because the discipline of saving something was a habit he had no intention of breaking, regardless of conditions. He also did something that Carl had never done, which was to call the people who owed him money and ask for it directly, without embarrassment, because he had earned it and he needed it, and there was no dignity in pretending otherwise. Terrence asked him one January evening, sitting in the garage, waiting for the weather to clear enough to make a run worth trying, whether he was worried. Danny was re-splicing a section of boom cable that had developed a weak spot. He kept working for a moment before he answered. "Worried," he said. "Yes, worried enough to work carefully and not make decisions I'll regret when things get better. He looked up. Bankrupt, no, because I don't owe anyone enough to make me bankrupt. He went back to the cable. There's a difference between those two things. A big one. Terrence nodded and said nothing, and Danny could see him filing it away in the place where a young man files the things he intends to build his life on. Then Walter got sick. Not the slow cough that had been part of the background of Danny's life since the early 80s. The sound that Walter produced and dismissed and Danny heard and didn't mention. Something definitive. In the fall of 1989, Walter went to see a doctor about the cough, which was in itself a measure of how serious it had become, because Walter Kovar had not voluntarily visited a doctor in the previous 11 years and came home with a diagnosis of emphysema, advanced enough that the doctor was direct about what it meant. 30 years of breathing the atmosphere of a steel mill, the particular mixture of particulates and chemicals and heat and everything else that a working industrial environment puts into the air of the men who spend their lives inside it. The bill had come due. Walter told Danny about the diagnosis on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, in the flat factual tone he used for things he had already accepted and moved past. He gave Danny the medical terminology, the prognosis, the timeline the doctor had suggested. Danny listened. There was nothing to say that Walter would have found useful, so Danny said nothing. He drank his coffee and looked at his father's hands, which were still the hands of a man who had worked with them every day of his adult life, and he thought about the 30 years of early mornings and shift changes and the particular quality of exhaustion that came from that kind of work. And he felt something that he would not have known how to name at the time, but that was a combination of grief and respect that sat together in the chest, the way heavy things sit when there is nowhere to put them down. That evening, Danny went to the garage and spent 2 hours doing maintenance work on the homes that did not strictly need doing yet. The next few years were defined by a kind of attentiveness on Danny's part that he had not had to practice before. He was available. He found reasons to be at the house more often. He did the maintenance on Walter's car without being asked and handled things around the property that Walter's breathing no longer allowed him to do comfortably, and he did all of this without making it into a thing that required acknowledgement, because Walter would not have wanted acknowledgement, and Danny understood that. Walter still came to the garage, less often and for shorter periods, but he came. He would sit in his chair and watch Danny work, and sometimes he would ask one of his questions, and the questions were as good as they had ever been. The mind had not been touched by what the lungs were going through. One evening in the late fall of 1990, Walter came out to the garage and sat down and looked at the homes for a long time without saying anything. Danny was working on the International. He let the silence be what it was. "You know what I regret," Walter said finally. Danny looked over at him. "I spent 30 years fixing other men's machines." Walter's voice was steady, but quieter than it had once been, because the lungs required more management now. Fixing them well, better than they needed to be fixed sometimes, because that was the right way to do it. He paused. "But none of it had my name on it. Not one piece of it. I fixed it and walked away, and it belonged to someone else, and when the plant closed, the 30 years closed with it." He looked at Danny. "You have got your name on that truck, John, because of what you taught me," Danny said. Walter shook his head slightly. "I gave you the tools. You decided what to build." He looked back at the homes. "That's yours. Whatever happens with it, it's yours. You built it from what everyone said was nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "That matters. More than I knew how to tell you when you were young enough that it would have helped." Danny did not respond immediately. He stood with his hand resting on the International's fender and looked at his father in the folding chair in the corner of the garage, a man who had carried heavy things his entire life and was now carrying the heaviest one. And he understood that this was Walter saying something that Walter had never quite been able to say before, and that it had cost him something to say it, and that the appropriate response was to receive it fully and not diminish it with too many words. "I know, Dad," he said. Walter nodded. He sat for a while longer, and then he got up and went inside, and that was the last time he came to the garage. Walter Kovar died in April of 1991. He was 73 years old. The funeral was small and precise, and attended by people who had known him for decades, men from the neighborhood and from the machine shop and from the Slovak social hall, men of his generation who showed up in their good coats and said very little, because very little was the appropriate thing to say. The week after the funeral, on a Thursday evening, Danny drove the Holmes to the cemetery on the east side of town. He parked outside the iron gate and sat with the engine running and looked through the windshield at the rows of stones in the late April light. He didn't go inside. He sat for 15 minutes, maybe 20, with his hands in his lap and the engine running steadily under the hood, the same engine he had freed from rust and boredom and 7 years of sitting in a city garage, the engine his father had told him he could fix when everyone else said he couldn't. Then he put the truck in gear and drove home. Some debts don't have a form of payment that language can describe. The recession years ground down slowly toward recovery, the way Pennsylvania winters ground down toward spring, gradually and without announcement, so that at some point you realize the worst is behind you, but you couldn't say exactly when it turned. By 1993, the work had come back to something close to its previous level. Carl Briggs had stabilized at a smaller operation, 4 trucks, now the new facility, gone working out of a lot on the south side that was adequate without being impressive. I was still around, still operating. The green Chevrolets were older and fewer. The gold letters on the doors were less bright. Danny and Terrence did not discuss Carl Briggs. There was nothing to discuss. A man had made choices about how to build his business, and the choices had had consequences, and that was the whole story. By 1994, Kovar Recovery had been operating for 17 years. Danny was 44 years old. He had 2 trucks, both paid for. 1 employee who had been with him for 11 years. A client base that was not large, but was loyal in the way that clients who have been treated fairly for a long time are loyal. He was not wealthy. He was not prominent. He did not have a facility with his name on it in illuminated letters. What he had was this: he owed nothing to anyone. His name meant something in the community. It mattered too, and every morning he drove a truck that he had built from what everyone said was worthless, and it had never let him down. It was a summer evening in 1994 when the Holmes told him something was there. I was checking the cab for the soft spot in the floor that he had been aware of for a few weeks, the faint give under the driver's side floor mat that spoke of rust, working from underneath the slow, patient damage that Pennsylvania road salt does to old metal over enough winters. He was going to have to replace the floor pan. Not urgent, but on the list. I was down on one knee with a flashlight pressing the floor in different places to map the extent of the rot when his elbow brushed the back wall of the cab, the vertical panel behind the driver's seat that separated the cab from the engine compartment, and his hand followed automatically, pressing the surface to steady himself. The sound was wrong. He pressed again, deliberately this time, 2 knuckles against the metal. One side gave back the flat thud of solid material. The other side, closer to the driver's door, gave back something different, a sound with space behind it, hollow where it shouldn't be hollow if the panel was simply the cab wall. Danny moved the flashlight. He looked at the panel from the side. Then he went and got his tape measure from the toolbox on the workbench. He measured the cab exterior door to door, 66 inches. He measured the cab interior door panel to door panel, 58 inches. He stood there in the fading summer light with the tape measure in his hand and did the subtraction. 8 inches, not insulation, not structural reinforcement. 8 solid inches of interior space hidden behind a welded panel running the full width of the cab. Danny stood completely still for a moment. The garage was quiet around him. From outside came the sound of the neighborhood in summer, a dog somewhere, kids on bicycles, the distant sound of someone's television through an open window. He looked at the panel. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the cab door and put the tape measure back on the workbench and stood in the garage for a while doing nothing in particular, which was not a thing Danny Kovar normally did. I was not ready. He could not have said why not. Superstition, not fear exactly. More the instinct of a man who knows that some things once opened change the shape of what you know, and that there are moments when you need to wait until you're ready to be changed. He turned off the garage light and went inside, but the number stayed with him. 8 inches, all through that fall, through the winter, through the following spring, while he was pulling calls and running maintenance and paying bills and doing all the ordinary things that made up the ordinary weight of his days. 8 inches was there at the back of his mind, quiet and patient, waiting, the way something waits when it has been waiting for a very long time and has learned not to be in a hurry. The floor pan gave out completely in February of 1995. Danny was pulling a call on a Tuesday night, a family in a station wagon that had spun out on a patch of black ice on Cedar Avenue and kissed the guardrail hard enough to bend the front axle. Routine work. He had done it 1,000 times, but when he climbed back into the homes afterward and put his weight on the driver's side floor, the metal gave under his boot with a sound that was less a creak and more a surrender, a soft, final collapse of something that had been holding on longer than it should have. He drove home carefully, feeling the give in the floor with every shift of his weight, and when he got back to the garage, he pulled the floor mat and crouched down with his flashlight and looked at what 17 Pennsylvania winters of road salt had done to the metal underneath. It was time. He scheduled the floor pan replacement for a Saturday in early March, when the weather had eased enough that working in the garage was not an exercise in suffering. He ordered the sheet metal through the supply house, had it cut to spec, gathered his tools. He had done this kind of work before, not on the home specifically, but on enough old trucks to know the sequence and the pitfalls. Stripped the interior to bare metal, cut out the rotted section fit, and weld the new pan, treat the bare metal, reassemble. He started at 7 in the morning. By 9, he had the seat out and the floor mat removed and was cutting the first section of rotted metal with his angle grinder, working from the outside edge, inward, tracing the boundary between what was salvageable and what wasn't. The sparks came off the grinder in small arcs and died on the concrete floor. The garage smelled of hot metal and the particular sharpness of rust being cut through. By 10:30, he had the old floor pan out and was cleaning the frame rails, brushing off the loose rust, and checking the welds that held the cab structure together. Good welds, solid, the kind of work that the men who had built this truck in Chattanooga in 1952 had done without being asked to do it well, because that was simply what doing it correctly required. I was wire brushing the rear frame rail, working from front to back, when his brush reached the base of the rear cab wall, the panel he had measured in the summer, the one with 8 inches missing, and he felt the edge of a weld seam that shouldn't be there, not the factory weld that attached the panel to the floor, a different weld lower running horizontally along the base of the panel at floor level, smoother than the factory work, done by hand by someone who knew what they were doing at some point after the truck had left Chattanooga. Danny set the wire brush down. He crouched there on the bare steel of the cab floor with his flashlight in one hand and looked at the seam for a long time. The morning light came through the garage windows at a low angle and caught the edge of the weld and threw it into relief against the surrounding metal. I had known this moment was coming since July of the previous year. He had known it and deferred it and carried the knowledge of it through 8 months of ordinary days, and now the ordinary days had delivered him here to this moment on a Saturday morning in March. He was not sure he was ready, but the floor was out and the weld was visible, and the Holmes had waited long enough. I went to the workbench and got his angle grinder and fitted a cut-off wheel to it. He came back to the cab and positioned himself and looked at the weld seam one more time. Then he started cutting. He worked slowly, more slowly than the task technically required. Not caution about the structural integrity. The panel was not load-bearing in any critical sense, but something else. The feeling of a man who understands that what he is doing cannot be undone, and that undone things change the shape of what comes after them. The cut-off wheel moved along the weld seam from left to right, throwing sparks eating through the bead of metal that had held this panel in place for more years than Danny had been alive. When he reached the right edge, he cut the vertical seams at each end, shortcuts 4 inches each. Then he set the grinder down, fitted a pry bar into the gap at the bottom, and applied steady pressure. The panel moved. Resistance, then a give, then the sound of something that had been sealed for a very long time, breaking its seal. The panel came free, and Danny set it aside. Behind it was a space 8 inches deep, running the full width of the cab, roughly 40 inches wide, 8 inches deep, 18 inches tall. The space was dark and smelled of old metal and something else, something dry and enclosed, the particular smell of air that has been sealed away from the world for decades. Danny aimed the flashlight into it. There was a bag, canvas military surplus, olive drab, the kind of bag that had been used for everything from tool storage to laundry in the years after the Second World War. It had been placed carefully in the compartment, not thrown in, placed with the opening folded over twice, and tied with a length of cotton cord that had stiffened with age into something closer to wire. Danny reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than he expected. He set it on the workbench and stood there with his flashlight and looked at it for a moment. Then he untied the cord, which required some effort because of how thoroughly it had hardened, and unfolded the top of the bag and reached inside. His hand found oilcloth, a careful wrapping, double-layered, sealed at the edges with a tar-based compound that had dried hard. He worked the wrapping open and found inside it a metal cash box, the kind that offices and small businesses had used for petty cash in that era. Tin construction, simple latch carrying handle, on top painted black, with a small dent in one corner where it had been dropped or struck at some point in its life. He set the cash box on the workbench. He opened the latch. Inside he found 3 things. The first was money, paper currency, old bills, nothing newer than the late 1960s by the look of the printing and the condition of the paper. 5s and 10s and 20s bundled with rubber bands that had long since lost their elasticity and were now just stiff loops of dried rubber that crumbled slightly when he touched them. He did not count it immediately. He set the bundles aside in a careful row on the workbench. The second was a notebook, standard composition book, black and white cover, the kind that had cost 15 cents at any drugstore in America for most of the 20th century. He opened it and found page after page of handwriting, neat, small, the careful print of a man who had learned to write when penmanship was taught as a discipline, and who had maintained the habit of precision. Each entry was dated and formatted the same way: date, location, vehicle description, nature of service, fee collected. He turned to the first page, January 4, 1950. He turned to the last completed entry, December 29, 1968. 19 years of towing calls written by hand, every single one. The third thing was an envelope, letter size, sealed with nothing written on the outside. The seal had dried and lost its adhesion over the decades, and the flap lifted without resistance. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten on lined paper, torn from a legal pad in the same careful small print as the notebook. Danny sat down on the floor of his garage, his back against the workbench, the letter in both hands, and he read it. My name is Earl McGuire. If you are reading this, I am most likely dead, and you have found what I left behind. I want to explain it because I do not want anyone to think it is something other than what it is. I drove this wrecker for the City of Scranton Department of Public Works from January of 1950 until my retirement in December of 1969. 19 years. It was the best job I ever had. Not because of the pay, which was not much, and not because of the conditions, which were sometimes difficult, because every day someone needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. I pulled 3 247 vehicles over those 19 years. I counted them because I thought they deserved to be counted. Every one of those calls was a person having the worst hour of their day, and I was the person who showed up. The city paid me $3 per call. I kept $1 from each call for myself. My supervisor at the time told me this was acceptable, a customary arrangement. He called it a small addition to the base wage for a job that required judgment and availability at all hours. I kept every dollar I took in a safe place, and I did not touch it. Over 19 years, that money became what you are holding, $4,800. I counted it many times. I did not tell my wife Edna about the money, not because I was hiding anything dishonest from her, but because Edna had ideas about what money should be used for, and my idea was different from hers, and I wanted to use it my way without the argument. That was not fair to her, and I am sorry for it. My plan was to buy the garage on the corner of Pittston Avenue and Linden Street. It had been for sale for 5 years. I wanted to open a small towing operation when I retired, serve the neighborhood, keep prices low enough that the people I had been pulling out of ditches for 19 years could actually afford to call me. The garage sold in November of 1969 to someone else. I retired in December, and in January of 1970 the doctor told me what my lungs had become after 19 years of breathing diesel exhaust in this cab and asbestos insulation in the mill before that. He said 6 months, maybe less. So the money has nowhere to go. The dream has nowhere to go. I am putting this here because I do not know what else to do with it. I am not going to give it to the city, which did not earn it. I am not going to let it disappear. Whoever finds this, the money is clean. I earned every dollar of it by showing up in the middle of the night when someone needed help, and I kept it with the intention of using it to keep helping people. If you are reading this, the truck came to you somehow, and if the truck came to you, maybe you are the kind of person who understands what it was used for. Maybe you can do what I could not. This truck saved a lot of people. Whatever you do, let it keep saving. Earl McGuire, January 12, 1969. Danny read it once straight through, and then he sat with it in his lap and looked at the wall of the garage across from him, and he did not move for a long time. Outside, the neighborhood was doing what the neighborhood did on a Saturday morning in March. Cars going by, someone shoveling a walk 2 houses down, the distant sound of a hardware store's delivery truck making its rounds, the completely ordinary texture of a completely ordinary morning in a mid-sized Pennsylvania city that had no idea what was sitting in a garage on its south side. Danny read the letter a second time. He read it more slowly this time, stopping at certain lines. Every one of those calls was a person having the worst hour of their day, and I was the person who showed up. He read that sentence 3 times. He thought about Mrs. Petrovsky on the church steps in her good coat and the family in the station wagon on Cedar Avenue last Tuesday night, and the hundreds of calls in between, the ones he remembered clearly and the ones that had blurred together into the general texture of the work. I thought about the number, 247. He got up and counted the money. He counted it twice the way he counted anything important, making sure the first number and the second number agreed before he accepted either of them as true. $4,800. He stood at the workbench and looked at it. The careful bundles, the old bills, the notebook with 19 years of handwritten entries, the letter from a man named Earl McGuire, who had died in 1969 with a plan that the world had not allowed him to execute. I did the calendar arithmetic. Earl had written the letter on January 12th, 1969. Danny was standing here on March 17th, 1995. The notebook said Earl had worked this truck until December 1969. The county records show Danny would look this up later, but he already half knew it from the auction paperwork that the city had retired the homes in the spring of 1969, around the time Earl's health had made it impossible for him to drive. Earl had hidden this in January. The city had retired the truck in the spring. The truck had sat in the city garage from 1969 until the surplus auction in August of 1976. 7 years of sitting, then Danny's $350, then 19 more years of driving. Earl McGuire had been dead for, Danny did the subtraction, 26 years. He picked up the letter again and looked at the date, January 12th, 1969. Then he looked at the wall calendar above the workbench, the one from the auto parts supplier that he had been meaning to replace since January because it still said February. Today was March 17th, 1995. He went to the desk in the corner and found the record book where he kept his accounts, and he found the notes he had taken from the auction paperwork in 1976. He found the reference to the city's retirement of the vehicle, March 17th, 1969. The city had retired this truck on the same date Earl had died. He would look up the death record later to confirm, but he already knew. He could feel the certainty of it, the way you feel the certainty of a correctly torqued bolt, not dramatically, just solidly, finally right. Danny set down the record book. I went outside and stood in the cold March air in his driveway in his work clothes with grease on his hands, and he looked up at the sky, which was the flat gray of a Pennsylvania March, and he stood there for a while doing nothing except existing in the fact of what had just happened. Earl McGuire had hidden a dead man's dream in a truck on the day he knew he was dying, and the truck had carried it for 26 years, waiting, through 7 years in a city garage where nobody wanted it, through a public auction where everyone laughed at the man who bought it, through 19 years of Pennsylvania winters and highway calls, and a rebuilt engine, and new seals, and a replaced boom cable, and all the accumulated ordinary maintenance of a working life, waiting for someone who would know what to do with it. Danny went back inside. He found the county records he needed at the Lackawanna County Courthouse on Monday morning, where a clerk named Patricia, who had worked there for 22 years, helped him navigate the filing system with the efficient patience of someone who took quiet pride in knowing where everything was. Earl James McGuire, born September 3, 1911, died March 17, 1969. Cause of death, pulmonary fibrosis, secondary to occupational exposure. Survived by his wife, Edna Claire McGuire, and one daughter. The daughter's name was Ruth. Ruth Ann McGuire, born 1942. Patricia found the marriage record. Ruth Ann McGuire married Gerald Hanks in June of 1964. An address search through the county's current records took 20 minutes and turned up a Ruth A. Hanks in Wilkes Barre, a city 18 miles south of Scranton, in a house on a street that sounded like a residential neighborhood of the kind Earl McGuire would have recognized. Danny wrote the address down carefully. He thanked Patricia. He drove back to South Scranton. I sat at his kitchen table that evening with a cup of coffee and the piece of paper with Ruth Hanks's address on it, and thought about what he was going to do, not whether he had not been uncertain about that since the moment he finished reading the letter the first time, but how. How do you call a woman in her 50s, a woman you have never met, and tell her that her father, who died a quarter century ago, left something behind in a truck that ended up in your garage? There was no elegant way to do it. There was only the direct way, which was the only way Danny had ever known how to approach things that mattered. He called the number from the phone in his kitchen on a Tuesday evening. It rang 4 times, and then a woman answered her voice, careful in the way that people's voices are careful when an unfamiliar number calls in the evening. "Mrs. Hanks," Danny said, "my name is Danny Kovar. I live in Scranton. I own a towing company here, and I need to talk to you about your father." A pause. "My father has been gone for a long time, Mr. Kovar." "I know. That's why I'm calling." He paused, trying to find the sequence that would make sense. "I bought a surplus truck at a county auction in 1976, a 1952 Holmes wrecker that used to belong to the city. I've been operating it ever since. Last week I was replacing the floor, and I found a hidden compartment in the cab. Inside it was a cash box and a letter." Another pause. "The letter was from Earl McGuire, your father, ma'am. He wrote it in January of 1969. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Danny checked the receiver to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "He wrote it," Ruth Hanks said finally. Her voice had changed. Something in it had opened up. "Yes, ma'am. 2 pages handwritten. He explained the money and what he had saved it for. He explained about the garage on Pittston Avenue." Danny kept his voice steady. "He wrote about wanting to serve the neighborhood, about the 247 calls." Ruth made a sound that was not quite a word. Danny waited. "My father drove that truck for 19 years, she said. Her voice was careful now, in a different way, the careful of someone managing something large. We never knew he had saved anything. He died, and we thought he had left nothing. We buried him in the cheapest casket the funeral home had, because that was what we could afford, and we were not ashamed of it because we thought that was all there was." A pause. "And you're telling me he left $4,000 in the truck?" $4,800, Danny said. "I counted it twice." Another silence. "Mr. Kovar," Ruth said slowly, "that truck was sold at a public auction. You bought it. By any law I know of, whatever was in it belongs to you." "I know that, Mrs. Hanks." "Then why are you calling me?" Danny looked at the piece of paper on the table in front of him, at Ruth's address, written in his own handwriting. He thought about Earl McGuire, sitting in this same cab, or close enough to the same. The cab hadn't changed much on a January morning in 1969, writing 2 pages of careful explanation to someone he would never meet, trying to make sure that what he had earned didn't just disappear. "Because your father drove strangers home in the middle of the night for 19 years, Danny said. "He showed up every time someone was having the worst hour of their day, and he helped them, and he kept a record of every single one of them, because he thought they deserved to be counted. And then he died before he got what he had worked for." He paused. "The least I can do is make sure you know he didn't die with nothing, and the least I can do beyond that is give you half of it." Ruth Hanks was quiet for a long time. "Half," she said, $2,400. The other half I intend to use to do what your father intended to do with it." He drove to Wilkes Barre on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later with $2,400 in an envelope on the passenger seat of the Holmes. Ruth Hanks lived in a small house on a quiet street, well maintained in the way that houses are well maintained when the person inside them takes pride in the ordinary. She was in her early 50s, a solid woman with her father's careful eyes and the particular composure of someone who had learned early that life required management rather than reaction. She met Danny at the door and shook his hand and looked at the Holmes parked at the curb with an expression he couldn't entirely read. She made coffee. They sat at her kitchen table, and Danny told her everything: the auction, the laughter, Carl Briggs, the years of driving the floor pan, the compartment, the cash box, the letter. He had brought photocopies of the letter and the first and last pages of the notebook, and he set them on the table and let her read. She read slowly the way her father had apparently written, with complete attention, not rushing. When she finished, she set the pages down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "He never told us," she said. "Not a word. My mother died in 1984, not knowing any of this existed. She looked up at Danny. She spent 15 years thinking he had left nothing. I'm sorry, Danny said. Ruth shook her head, not dismissing the apology, just setting it aside because it wasn't the point. He was a private man. He kept things to himself that he thought would cause argument. She almost smiled. He was right that it would have caused argument. My mother had opinions about money. So did he, Danny said. He wrote about that. He wanted to help people, Ruth said. It was not a question. I wanted to do exactly what I ended up doing, Danny said. Small operations serve the neighborhood, keep the prices fair. He had it planned out. The garage on Pittston Avenue. Ruth looked at the envelope on the table between them. Danny had set it there when he sat down, and neither of them had touched it since. Mr. Kovar, she said, you don't have to do this. Nobody would fault you. I know. The law is on your side. I know that too. She looked at him. Then why? Danny thought about how to answer that. He thought about Walter sitting in the corner of the garage on a Tuesday evening, asking questions that made you think, rather than giving answers that let you stop thinking. He thought about the particular quality of work that Earl McGuire had done for 19 years, not the towing itself, but the showing up, the reliability, the understanding that when you took on the job of being the person who came when things went wrong, that was not a job you got to do halfway, because your father drove this truck the right way, Danny said. He showed up and he helped people and he kept his word and he counted every single call because they deserved to be counted. He deserved to get what he saved for. He didn't get it. Danny looked at the envelope. This is the closest thing to making that right that I can actually do. Ruth Hanks picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and Danny watched something move across her face that he did not try to name because it was hers and not his. Thank you, she said. It was quiet and complete the way some things are said when they have been held for a long time before being released. Danny drove back to Scranton on a Saturday afternoon in March, with the windows down a few inches despite the cold, the homes running, the way it always ran steady deep, without complaint. He drove the long way through South Scranton, past the streets where he had grown up, past the machine shop on Cedar Avenue, past the Texaco station where he had worked for 6 years, past the Slovak Social Hall where Walter had spent Sunday afternoons for most of his adult life. I was thinking about names. The $2,400 remaining from Earl's cash box sat in the envelope on the passenger seat. Danny had known since before he drove to Wilkes Barre what he was going to do with it. The business had been operating informally for 17 years, not illegally licensed and insured as required, but without the formal registration of a legal business entity, which was a thing Danny had deferred for practical reasons that had now become the wrong reasons. Earl McGuire had saved this money to start something. The something he had wanted to start was, as near as Danny could tell, exactly what Danny had started anyway, in the same city for the same reasons. The money had found its way to the right place via a 17-year detour through the hidden compartment of a truck that refused to stop working. The least Danny could do was finish the paperwork. He filed the registration with Lackawanna County the following week. The business name he put on the form was McGuire Kovar Recovery. He called a sign painter he had used twice before, a man named Dale, who worked out of a shop on the north side and did good work at a fair price. He told Dale what he wanted on the driver's door of the homes. Dale came by the garage, measured the door, made a sketch. The lettering went on a Thursday morning. Danny stood in the driveway and watched Dale work. The lettering was in the same style as the Kovar Recovery that had been on the door since 1977, same font, same size. Dale painted over the old lettering first, then laid out the new. When he was done, Danny walked to the door and read it, McGuire Kovar Recovery, and below the business name in smaller letters, in memory of Earl McGuire, 1911 to 1969, who started this without knowing it. Danny stood there for a while. The March sun was making its first genuine effort of the year, and it caught the fresh paint and threw it back bright and clear against the faded red of the cab. I thought about Earl writing those 2 pages in January of 1969 in this cab, in this seat, writing them in the careful small print of a man who wanted to be understood precisely, sealing the cash box and the notebook and the envelope in oilcloth and canvas, and placing them in the compartment and welding the panel shut. An act of faith directed at no one in particular, a bet that the right person would find it. Danny wondered what Earl would have made of him, of the auction, of the laughter, of the $180 and the 1,200 in parts, and the 19 years of Pennsylvania winters. He wondered if Earl would have recognized him. He thought probably yes. He thought probably Earl McGuire would have recognized the species immediately, the same way that Walter had recognized the homes from across the auction lot, not by formal description, but by something older and more reliable than description, a sense of like meeting like. I thought about his father, about Walter's hands on the kappa the first night, the 2 careful knocks. I know this truck. About the 30 years at the mill that had left Walter with nothing he could put his name on, about the quiet, complete nod in the garage doorway on the August evening the engine first ran, about the chair in the corner and the cigarettes and the questions that made you think rather than the answers that let you stop. I thought about what Walter had said in the fall of 1990 toward the end, with the home sitting right there between them. You have got your name on that truck. That matters. It had mattered enough that a man Danny had never met had built a hidden compartment in that truck's cab and filled it with 26 years' worth of patience. Carl Briggs filed for bankruptcy in the spring of 1996. Danny heard about it from Terrence, who heard about it from someone at the County Emergency Services Dispatch Office, the same informal channel that most professional news traveled through in Lackawanna County. The details were what the details always were, in such cases overextension debt service that couldn't be met when the revenue softened, a negotiation with the bank that went the bank's way, as such negotiations tend to. Briggs' heavy recovery at its peak had operated 10 trucks and employed 7 people and held contracts with 3 different government entities. At the time of the bankruptcy filing, it operated 4 trucks and employed 2 people and held no government contracts. Danny heard the news on a Wednesday afternoon. He was in the garage doing routine maintenance on the International. Terrence told him, standing in the doorway with his coffee. Danny set down the wrench he had been using. He looked at the homes parked in its usual spot against the wall. I thought about Carl at the auction in 1976, the pressed shirt and the easy laugh and the loud voice and the complete certainty of a man who had never doubted his own judgment about what things were worth. He thought about Carl's 8 trucks under the floodlights at the open house in 1981. He thought about the question Danny had asked, "What do you owe the bank right now?" And the way Carl had deflected it with the smoothness of a man who had been deflecting inconvenient questions for so long. He did it without thinking. He did not feel satisfaction. He had never wanted Carl to fail. Carl had been a useful thing, a mirror, a demonstration, a proof by contrast of the principle Danny had been building his life on since 1976. You don't need a man to fail in order for his example to be instructive. He had 10 trucks, Danny said to Terrence. The bank owned all of them. Terrence nodded. I had 1 truck, Danny said, and it was mine. He picked up the wrench and went back to work. The Holmes turned 43 years old in 1995, the year Danny found Earl's letter. By the time Danny handed the business to his son in 2015, the truck was 63 years old and had accumulated a number of miles that the original odometer had long since ceased to be relevant to. Danny had replaced the odometer cable twice and stopped keeping a cumulative count somewhere in the mid-200,000s, not because the number stopped mattering, but because the Holmes had moved past the point where numbers were the right way to describe what it was. It was not a number, it was a fact. It was a working truck that had been asked to work and had worked every day through Pennsylvania winters that were serious about being winters, through decades of road salt and frost heaves, and the particular punishment that a working vehicle absorbs through its frame when it is used as a working vehicle rather than kept for show. Danny's son Eddie took over the operation in 2015. He was 34 years old, had grown up watching his father drive the Holmes out of the driveway every morning since before he was old enough to understand what towing was, and had the same square shoulders and the same permanently stained hands and the same flat calm about useful things that Danny had arrived at through practice and Eddie had arrived at through watching Danny. Eddie kept the Holmes in service, not out of sentiment, or not only out of sentiment, out of the same practical logic his father had always applied to the question. The truck worked, it was paid for, the mechanicals were sound. You don't retire a working tool because it is old. You retire it when it stops working, and the Holmes had not stopped working. Ruth Hanks's son drove it sometimes. His name was Patrick. He was in his mid-40s, had come to work for McGuire Kovar 3 years after Danny retired through a phone call between Ruth and Danny. That was the most recent of a series of calls they had maintained across the decades following that Saturday morning in 1995. Ruth was in her 80s now, still in the same house in Wilkes Barre, still maintaining it with the same precise care. Patrick had grown up knowing the story, his grandfather's letter, the hidden compartment, the man who had driven south on a March morning with an envelope on the passenger seat and had arrived at the decision to work for McGuire Kovar with the unhurried certainty of a man who had always known where he was going and had simply been waiting until the right moment to go there. I was good at the work. He showed up and he helped people, and he kept his own informal count of calls because his grandfather had counted, and some practices deserved to be continued. On a Wednesday evening in November, Patrick was driving the Holmes north on I-81 when he saw the hazard lights. A minivan pulled onto the narrow shoulder near mile marker 94, listing slightly to the right. Patrick put on his overheads and eased in behind it. The family inside, a father, a mother, 3 children, the youngest asleep across the back seat, had blown a rear tire and discovered that their spare was flat, which is the kind of thing that happens to people who do not check the spare until they need it. Patrick changed the tire. It took 25 minutes. The father tried to pay him, and Patrick waved it off. He had called it in as a service stop, and the billing would be handled through the company at the regular rate, and the family had enough going on without conducting a cash transaction on an interstate shoulder at 9 in the evening. The mother asked him the name of the company. Patrick pointed to the door of the Holmes where the lettering caught the glow of the highway lights. McGuire Kovar Recovery. And below, in memory of Earl McGuire, 1911-1969, who started this without knowing it. The mother read it and looked at Patrick. Who was Earl McGuire? My grandfather, Patrick said. He drove this truck for 19 years, never owned it, just drove it and kept a record of everyone he helped. He looked at the lettering for a moment. He died before he got to do what he had planned. Someone else finished it. The mother looked at the words on the door for a moment longer, and then she looked at Patrick and she said, well, thank you. Patrick got back into the cab. The Holmes started on the first turn of the key, the way it always started, the engine settling immediately into its steady low note. He pulled back onto the highway, the overhead lights going dark as he merged into traffic, and he drove north into the November night. Danny Kovar was 74 years old and lived in the same house in South Scranton where he had grown up, which he had bought from his mother after Walter died, and maintained in the same condition that Walter had maintained it, not lavishly, but correctly, the way a man maintains something he intends to pass on. He still went to the garage most mornings, not to work or not primarily Eddie ran the business and ran it well, and Danny's involvement was the advisory kind that comes naturally to a man who built something from the ground up and finds it difficult to be entirely absent from it. But mostly, he went to the garage in the mornings because the garage was where he had always thought most clearly, and at 74, he had not found a better place. The Holmes came back to the garage on Sunday mornings when the overnight crew had signed off and the truck needed its weekly service check. Danny did the check himself most Sundays. It was not necessary. Eddie was more than capable, and Terrence's replacement, a young man named Owen, who had Walter Kovar's gift for asking the right questions, was thorough and reliable, but Danny did it anyway. I would run through the checklists the way he had run through it for going on 4 decades. Oil, coolant, hydraulic fluid, brake lines, boom cable tension, lights. He would drive it around the block, once feeling the engine through the steering wheel and the seat, the way you feel the health of a living thing through physical contact. He would listen. The Holmes always told him it was fine. It always had. On one of those Sunday mornings, Eddie came into the garage while Danny was checking the boom cable and stood in the doorway the way Walter had stood in doorways, not quite coming in, not quite staying out, occupying the threshold. "You know you don't have to do that," Eddie said. "I know," Danny said. He finished the cable check and straightened up. He put his hand flat on the cab door, on the lettering the way Walter had put his hand on the hood that first night. He could feel the raised edges of the letters under his palm. The paint was newer than the truck, but old enough to have settled into the metal the way paint does when it has had time. "Someone asked me last week," Eddie said, "why we keep running that truck. Said we could get good money for it as a restoration piece. Classic vehicle collectors, apparently there's a market." Danny looked at the Holmes. 43 years since the auction, 69 years since Chattanooga, every winter in between, 3 247 calls before Danny's time, and a number beyond counting since. Earl's 19 years and Danny's 19 years, and now Patrick carrying the third shift of something that had started in 1950 with a man who showed up every time someone needed help and thought they deserved to be counted. "What did you tell them?" Danny asked. "I told them it wasn't for sale." Danny nodded. He took his hand off the door. He picked up the clipboard with the service checklist and initialed the bottom. "Good answer," he said. He set the clipboard on the workbench and walked out into the Sunday morning, into the light that came off the South Scranton streets, the same way it always had, flat and honest and unimpressed with itself, the light of a city that had been working since before anyone currently living in it was born and intended to keep working regardless of what anyone thought about it. Behind him in the garage, the home sat the way it had always sat, ready, solid, carrying whatever it carried, waiting for the next call.